In question 55 of Secunda Secundae, St. Thomas Aquinas spends 8 articles, I think it is, going over vices which are opposed to prudence. And so the cardinal virtue is prudence. So what are the vices that are directly opposed to it? And what he does starting off is whether prudence of the flesh is a sin. And so this would have to do with something like lust or some related sin that puts too much emphasis on the flesh. And so Thomas says prudence regards things which are directed to the end of life as a whole. Hence, prudence of the flesh signifies properly the prudence of a man who looks upon carnal goods as the last end of his life. It's evident that this is a sin because it involves disorder in man with respect to his last end, which does not consist in the goods of the body. So, of course, taking care of our body and being concerned about our body is fine as long as it doesn't become our end, right? And so that's a pretty fundamental principle of Thomistic teaching. Article 2, whether prudence of the flesh is a mortal sin. And what he's going to say here is if the flesh and the desires of the flesh are placed as our final end, then it would be a mortal sin. But if it doesn't go to the point of us turning away from God because of them, then it could just be a venial sin if we don't place these carnal goods as our final end. He says sometimes it happens that a man has an inordinate affection for some pleasures of the flesh without turning away from God by a mortal sin, in which case he does not place the end of his whole life in carnal pleasures. And so in that case, it would not be a mortal sin. Article 3 says whether craftiness is a special sin. Of course, this would be something that is opposed to prudence. Prudence is right reason applied to action, just as science is right reason applied to knowledge. And then he says, when in order to obtain a certain end, whether good or evil, a man uses means that are not true but fictitious and counterfeit, so basically he's lying, and this belongs to the sin of craftiness. Thus, it consequently is a sin opposed to prudence and distinct from the prudence of the flesh. So this has to do more with basically doing whatever it takes to get what you want. And there's a certain prudence about that, but it's also based on lies and falsehoods. So therefore it would be a sin. Article 4, guile. Is it a sin pertaining to craftiness? He says it pertains to craftiness to adopt ways that are not true but counterfeit and apparently true in order to attain some end, either good or evil, as we just learned. Hence, guile denotes a certain execution of craftiness and accordingly belongs there too. So craftiness could, I guess, be in the mind, something you're thinking about, and then guile means you actually carry it out. Article 5, fraud. Does it pertain to craftiness? Just as guile consists in the execution of craftiness, so does fraud. But they seem to differ in the fact that guile belongs in general to the execution of craftiness, whether it be affected by words or by deeds, whereas fraud belongs more properly to the execution of craftiness by deeds. And so guile would not, fraud would not be words, it would be deeds, whereas guile could be words or deeds. Article 6, whether it is lawful to be solicitous about temporal matters. So I think solicitous means you're spending a lot of time thinking about it, you're worried about it, you're spending effort worrying about temporal matters. Solicitude denotes an earnest endeavor to obtain something. Now it is evident that the endeavor is more earnest when there is fear of failure, so that there is less solicitude when success is assured. Well, that certainly makes sense. Accordingly, solicitude about temporal things may be unlawful in 3 different ways. First, on the part of the object of solicitude, that is, if we seek temporal things as an end. Of course, if it's our final end, temporal things, then that, of course, will be a mortal sin by definition. Secondly, solicitude about temporal things may be unlawful through too much earnestness in endeavoring to obtain temporal things, the result being that a man is drawn away from spiritual things, which ought to be the chief object of his search. Again, here's the hierarchy again. Spiritual things are going to rank higher than temporal things, and if we have that upside down, then it's going to be a sin. Thirdly, through overmuch fear, when a man fears to lack necessary things if he do what he ought to do. And consequently, Thomas concludes that we should be solicitous most about spiritual things, hoping that temporal goods also may be granted to us according to our needs if we do what we ought to do. Okay, that's a very scriptural type of, teaching, right? And 7 says whether we should be solicitous about the future. No work can be virtuous unless it be vested with its due circumstances, and among these in the due time. For every time has its own fitting proper solicitude. Thus solicitude about the crops belongs to the summertime, and solicitude about the vintage to the time of autumn. Accordingly, if man were solicitous about vintage during the summer, he would be needlessly forestalling the solicitude belonging to a future time. Our Lord forbids such like excessive solicitude, saying, "Be not solicitous about tomorrow." Wherefore he adds, "For tomorrow will be solicitous for itself." That is to say that tomorrow will have its own worries. So everything has to be ordinate. Everything, you can worry about something if it's right in your face, but if it's something you're worrying about 10 or 15 years from now, or it has to conform to reason ultimately, right? It has to be on the right timing. Finally, Article 8 says whether these vices arise from covetousness. So all these vices kind of lumped together, whether it be guile, or it be craftiness, or it be, prudence of the flesh, sin against the flesh, or any of these, is a covetousness. He says, carnal prudence and craftiness, as well as guile and fraud, bear a certain resemblance to prudence in some kind of use of the reason. Now, among all the moral virtues, it is justice wherein the use of right reason appears chiefly, for justice is in the rational appetite. Okay, it has to do with the will, right? That which is a rational appetite. Hence, the undue use of reason appears chiefly in the vices opposed to justice, the chief of which is covetousness. Therefore, the aforesaid vices chiefly arise from covetousness, which is very good to know, because if you have any of these sins in you, like guile and craftiness and fraud, or any of the ones that he talked about, and you want to get rid of them, well, you got to check yourself and say, well, maybe I'm a covetous person, which Thomas also says elsewhere in the Summa is the root of all sin, is wanting things, an inordinate desire for things, or your desire for your own good, right? Self-good is going to be the root of all sin. All right, that does it for question 55, vices opposed to prudence. Thanks for joining me. God bless you.